Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you for joining us today for conversations every pool governing body should have. My name is Stephanie Weiss, and I'm the Director of Education and Events for AGRiP. In today's program, we will hear from public entity pool CEOs and board members about fundamental conversations every pool should be having, including orientation conversations, discussion about norms, expectations, responsibility, and working as a team. We'll hear about operational issues such as why it's important to understand the business of pooling and foundational documents such as bylaws. We'll also hear about strategic responsibilities such as budgeting with a long-term perspective in mind and succession planning. We have 4 panelists with us today. First, Craig Stevenson, the chairperson for Oklahoma Municipal Assurance Group. Craig has 30 years experience in municipal government and currently serves Ponca City, where he's been city manager since 2009. Also with us is Mary Scholender, who's serving her 10th year as a board member for the County Road Association Self-Insurance Fund. Mary is currently serving in her first term as chair with CRASIF. She has been employed by the Marquette County Road Commission since 1997, where she serves as the Director of Finance and Administration and as clerk. Jim deSpelder, the Administrator CEO of CRASIF, the County Road Association Self-Insurance Fund, is also with us. He's Chief Administrator of a group self-insured program fund that consists of 69 of the 77 eligible road commissions in Michigan, and the pool covers approximately 3,500 employees for workers' comp. John Schull is with us, and he's the Chief Executive Officer of California Joint Powers Insurance Authority. John has held this position since 2002. His responsibilities with the California JPIA include board relations, general administration, policy development, member communications, marketing, and external relations. Now, before I kick things off completely today, we're going to launch one of our first polls in this discussion, and this session is really meant to be collaborative. So I'd ask that all of our attendees take a moment and participate in the poll. And as you do that, I am going to talk through a few house cleaning notes and share one more poll. First, know that you can adjust the webinar volume on your own computer so it's at a level that's comfortable to you. If you're calling in by phone, you'll want to turn off any nearby wireless devices because this will help with your internet connection. If you experience any sound issues, consider switching between phone and computer sound using the GoToMeeting controls. It's important to know that all attendees are automatically on mute, so if you'd like to ask a question, type it into the question field on your webinar control panel. We'll answer your questions as we go if they're germane to the conversation. Otherwise, we'll hold them until the end. I'm going to close our first poll and share a couple of more housekeeping notes. I had mentioned already that we have several polls in this conversation, and so I am going to launch our second one while I wrap up the last of our housekeeping notes, and then I'm going to turn it over to John Schull. The last couple of notes for you to be mindful of is that there is one handout available to you. To access it, you want to navigate to the Handouts pane in the Webinar Control Panel and click the name of the file. It'll automatically begin to download, and then you can save the document to your computer. The second is that we are recording this webinar and we'll make it available on demand in the coming week or so. All right. So, John, I would like to turn it over to you, and we're still gathering some data from the poll. We've got about 27% of our attendees who've responded to the second poll. When I close that and the results are calculated, I'll wait for an appropriate moment to break in and share the first poll results with you and the second. So, John, if you'd like to take it over, please feel free.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. It's my pleasure to be here with you all this morning, and thank you for morning for me. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are and whatever time zone you're in. As Steph mentioned, we have basically 3 types of conversations that we want to talk about that as a panel, we felt were the conversations that every pool executive or legislative body should have. And those do fall into the areas of orientation, operations, and then strategy. So the first one we wanted to talk about was orientation. And we wanted to talk about this because often people who are joining the board are coming from other types of organizations, whether it be cities or schools or special districts, where they have norms in their operations, and they may not be the same types of things that they would have in running the pool or in governing the pool. So first we wanted to talk about what are those board norms, expectations, and responsibilities. And I think Craig was going to want to be able to share a few words about, how does one transition from, in his case, the city manager function and those responsibilities to those of being on the pool board. Craig?
Well, thanks, John, and welcome to everybody that's joining in. It's an afternoon here for us in the Central Standard Zone. I guess the first thing, the most important thing is really every one of you has had some success and know what you're doing, or you wouldn't be either in a staff position or CEO or on the board of your pool. So I think one of the most important things for me was to make sure I understood the culture. So that's a couple things. One is to understand the culture of the organization, what it represents within the pool, and the customers and the membership that it serves. So I think that's really important to have a clear understanding on that component piece. You should know that before you come in, because obviously you've been dealing with the pool in some manner. The other component is you eventually learn what the internal culture is like. And you only gather that, at least from my perspective, as you serve on the board and interact with the various staff members. One of the other things I think is important for a board member to understand is you're a board member. You're a policy setter, at least at OMAG, the board I'm on. I set policy. The board's not at all involved in any of the administration of the organization. We do have paid professional staff. They take care of those things, and sometimes you have to always be mindful of stepping back and going, not my role. And make sure we stay in the policy setting. Treat it just like if you're a staff person and you're on the board, treat it like you want your board and your governing body to treat you. Stay out of your business and you set the policy and let them administer it.
Thanks, Craig. I think another part that we want to make sure we take a look at is, as a board member of the pool, we may have experience of our own as a CEO or as a city manager, what have you. But when you're a board member and you're dealing with another public official who is in that CEO capacity, there are expectations that you have of that CEO and that CEO has of you. And it does come down to that line between policy setting and administration. And Mary, I know we've got a good audience, a good group here, because we've got Mary who's on the board and Jim who is her CEO. But Mary, what are your expectations of and with the CEO?
You bring up a very good point, and this is a great discussion on that. And it is very challenging because most of us who are in these roles have a leadership in our member organizations. And sometimes it's quite challenging to step back and remember that we really are part of the group that is the board, and to think as a part of a group rather than individually and take leadership on these kinds of things. At the same time, it's very important that the group identify what the expectations are for the person who's in charge, our administrators. And I think it's important that those discussions take place, because everybody comes to the board with their own ideas of what their expectations might be. And it's nice to be able to discuss them. I think it's important to be able to discuss them both with each other and as well as the administrators, so that they have an opportunity to ask questions and to identify what the group is looking for, which can often, as we all know, be very challenging. One of the other things we're talking about is the role of staff. And as well as the administrator, we have to recognize and allow the administrator to run the business, the day-to-day business. And sometimes it's difficult in those roles also. As the finance director here at Marquette County Road Commission, one of the things that was kind of challenging and a good example of what Craig said, I had to stand back and say, no, step back. We hired a new finance person for our pool, and she was just looking for help in making sure that the financial reports looked the way we as a board might want them to look. And it was very tempting for me to jump in with both feet and get a hold of those. And I thought, no, that is not my job. I have to step back and let our staff work through the administrator with our board. And I think that's really the key, is working through the administrators when it comes to the board level, which is often, again, challenging.
You know, John, before we continue before we continue on, I thought that this would be a really great spot to share the results from our first two polls. We just talked a little bit about role with staff and expectations of the chief executive. And the makeup of the community joining us today, we have 50% of our attendees today are attending as CEOs or top executives. We have 25% of our attendees are from a governing body, and 25% are staff. Now, you guys are just getting ready to talk about some of the areas where folks need to work as a team. And we asked a poll question that started, in my role with my public entity pool, I struggle with. And we asked people to identify what they struggle most with. We had a three-way tie with people struggling with understanding my duty to my pool versus an individual member, the range of personalities with whom I interact, and my expectations of myself. So you might want to talk about those a little bit more in detail when we move on to the next section of this slide.
Great, thank you, Steph. You know, I think it's really interesting to have the split that we have with the CEO and the board and the staff, particularly because one of the things that often is challenging is the understanding of someone's role when they are on the board versus staff. And Mary was just touching on this, and I like to talk about, you know, often we say, you know, the board's getting into the weeds. Right? We don't want the board in the weeds. Well, the important part for staff is to ensure that you're demonstrating that someone is in the weeds and you're reporting out what you're finding there. And that, I think, is a way to keep a board at a policy setting, 30,000-foot level, engaged where they need to be engaged, but not in the weeds, if you will, just to make sure that they understand that someone is in the weeds. We'll get to, I think, some of the discussions on the second poll in just a moment. One of the things that we wanted to talk about was really working as a team, the board and the staff. And I know Jim has had some experience with that. He wanted to share.
Thank you, John. You know, it's interesting. We all, I think, for the most part, want to work as a team, but making that team work as a team is always the challenge. And, you know, I like to coach basketball and always like to tell my players there's no I in team, and it's a familiar adage. But the key, and it's interesting to see from the poll that was just taken about how knowing expectations, knowing what you're supposed to do, knowing what others expect from you is a key question that many of us have. And we constantly in our pool are talking about that. It's interesting, 9 years in as administrator, and Mary can attest to this, I think we're still talking about the roles that the board have and the administrator. And we can come to some general agreements about how we want to approach things. For example, being at a policy level versus being in the administration level. Organization where obviously they're going to be tested. And one of the tests we had, Mary kind of brought up, and it was interesting in hiring that person that there was questions on the board about what is the role of the board? Should I have gone to get the approval of the board for this hire? or if it's in the budget, do I have freedom to just go ahead and make those decisions and then report back to the board? So different pools do it differently, but it's good to acknowledge what that difference is and accept it, put it in writing. Position descriptions are critical. As much as we know them to be important, it is surprising how very few organizations have them. And when you put them in writing in terms of how you relate to one another, I kind of call that your governance model. It's how you're going to work with each other. And you can almost always expect that if you want to work as a team, you're going to have conflicts. And you have to be dedicated as both staff and the board to be willing to work those out. And I know at our strategic planning retreat, we set aside to evaluate not just the administrator's role, but the board goes in and evaluates themselves as well, which I think is real critical. So, in terms of attitudes and working as a team, transparency and accountability equal trust. And there's ways to measure it, but it's critical to have both of those, transparency and accountability. We also talk about, working, I talked about conflict. And one of the key parts of dealing with conflict is learning how to respectfully dissent within the organization. And sometimes the pool administrator may have to disagree with the board, and hopefully you would have the ability to say those kinds of things and the reason why. But also from the board's perspective, that once a decision is made as a board, that's a decision of the board. And it's key to be in agreement as a team board that you're not going to go out and advocate anything different than what the board agreed to. And to maintain that unity as a board is very, very important, particularly if you're going to continue to work, develop trust on the board.
Jim, let me jump in here for just a second. I wanted to highlight something that AGRiP is going to be doing over the next year, or is continuing to do, and we'll be discussing in the next couple of weeks at our CEO and Senior Staff Institute, and that is the idea of inclusion. And having an inclusive board will give you different perspectives that can lead to some dissent. There's different ideas. Sometimes not everyone's going to get what they want, but I think ultimately by having those conversations and having that respectful dissent, the board does better work, and people get to know one another better and respect one another better. And then as the board makes those decisions, it does get to a place of, okay, the board has acted. Now we can all come together around the decision that's been made. So I think it's important to recognize the value of inclusivity in, whether that's demographic or experiential, whatever it might be, but to have different types of people and different thoughts on in the conversation.
Oh, absolutely. And having a legal background, we have one of those adages that the reasonable people can differ, and there's many different ways of accomplishing a goal. And to value the experience of your board is critical. And when you do dissent, a key part, and we've often talked about this in AGRiP, is the code of conduct. And we have one, and we focus on the behavior and on the situation, not the person. Those are the kinds of things that, particularly if you're going to look at inclusivity, that you just got to be willing to work through. And it takes often one person or two to really challenge everybody to make sure that we're doing that. One of the other things that we recognized, is talking about the panel for today is, there are different duties that everybody has. A part of that is administrative, part of that is policy, but there's a duty to the pool that is different than the member, and this can get in the various politics. Mary, did you have some thoughts about how important that is and how you see that being played out?
Yes, I think it's very important. I think it's one of the things that we have to be really mindful of. It's not something that just comes natural. It's not easy for most of us to step outside of what we normally do. And our role as board members is often very different than our regular work day or our regular role at work. And I think it's really important. One of the things that we can do to really help that is to really educate ourselves in that role. Help identify what it is specifically. You know, is this policy or isn't it? Is this administrative or is it not? And I think it's important because our members are counting on us. You know, when we get elected to these positions as board members, the membership are counting on us to be able to think big picture, not just the membership that you represent or the member county or whatever the organization is that you represent or come from, but you now represent everybody. And here in Michigan, that can be a challenge. We've got some very rural areas. I'm from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, 800 miles away from some of the people that I'm representing on the board, but it's still important that I think big county just as much as small county, and I think that's really important. One of the ways, like I said, is to educate ourselves.
Excellent. John, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the idea of recognizing your duty as a board member of a pool, you have a bigger picture that's needed. You need to be able to step away from your role as the CEO or the city manager of your member entity. And then you also have to step back from your duty to yourself in some cases, where it's expected of you that you're going to act as the pool board member for the benefit of the pool. Now, our pool is set up with an executive committee and a board of directors that are elected officials. They are city council members. And often my colleagues think that, wow, that must be really challenging to have elected officials running your pool. And I'm finding it's not, because they do tend to be able to step away from the personal involvement in the decision making and think more bigger picture. They don't have any turf or any dog in the fight, if you will, as to a decision that's being made on behalf of the pool personally. Whereas in some pools, it's the risk managers who are running the pool, and if they've decided that they're going to raise rates, well, their individual member entity is going to see increased costs, and that could negatively affect them. So it's really important to differentiate between your duty to yourself, your duty to your home member entity, and then the duty to the pool as you serve on the board.
One of the ways I think that you can often know if you're successful in having this type of culture is when you do find board members who will stop themselves and say, wait a minute, I'm thinking more as, a city manager in my position rather than as a overall pool governance model, or I'm getting more into the weeds than I should. And when those things are going on, then you know you've achieved some of the culture that you really want to achieve. John had talked about board versus executive committee versus committees. It's just good to know, how does your organization function? And every pool, in my experience, kind of does a little bit differently. And it all depends a lot on, the number of board members that you have. Our board is a 9-member board and has elected at this time really not to have any executive committees or standing committees. We may have an ad hoc committee to accomplish a certain task, but the board really wants to hear all the information. They want to make the decision collectively. But the bigger the board, the harder that is. So it is unique to, I think, every different pool. Also unique to every different pool, as we know, is there are many different personality types. And we've done some work in this area and been really challenged, and our eyes have been open in a lot of ways about how to work together. Mary, you want to talk about that?
I would love to. It's really kind of an interesting concept. And one of the things that we've done and found very, very important and effective with our board is we actually do the personality testing. So we get an idea. We go through the process, facilitator, and find out the different types of personalities that make up our board. And you talked previously, John, about the diversity and how a diverse group really provides for different perspectives. And one of the key things that we found is just being able to identify which of us on our boards are the people that are quick to make a decision, don't need to hear every little thought or process on it. We just can hear the overall picture, ask a few questions, and are quick to make a decision. Other people are slower to change, and they want to hear every single detail and take their time and process it. And eventually we'll be able to come up with, eventually do come up with a very thought out opinion or comment. And it's really quite interesting because as a chair, I've learned and we've seen the importance of giving those people time to truly process the information that's being provided to them. Recognize that there are those people that are going to answer and make decisions quickly, but be respectful of the people that are going to take more time, think things through a little more clearly, identify that there's some people are more slow to change, and just allow the perfectionist people to check every box before they make a decision. We've actually gotten to where we joke about it now and kind of try to guess what a new person on our board might be, just given the personality. And again, the diversity that it brings is really important because it just balances things. You can really see where decisions are not just a small percentage, those dominant people in the group making the decisions, but allowing for everybody to be heard and everybody to have a voice. So I think it's really important. I think that's one of the things that's key, and it's in my opinion, as the chair, I've seen it to be a very important tool in running the meetings. It would be unfortunate if I look over a board member that needs that extra time to think and only listen to those people who are quick to answer.
You're absolutely right, and that does work against really developing a team mentality. And one of the things we've learned is it's important for everybody at the end of the meeting to have something to say. So in other words, we don't open it up on our agenda to say, does any board member have something to say? We actually go to each board member and to give them an opportunity to say something. And I think that's one way of making sure that those who may be reluctant to raise a hand or say something in a group will have an opportunity to do that. The system that we kind of use, just so people know, is the DISC system. I'm sure there's others that could be helpful. But what we found too is that the personality types do change. And it depends somewhat on your role, and particularly as people get older, you just change. Part of this is having expectations, for yourself in terms of working as a team. And we have two items there in the outline: can't be a subject matter expert and learning curve. Craig, do you want to add some points to this?
Sure. I just think it's for myself, my expectations are that I have to trust staff that provides information. I also have to make sure that I'm wearing the proper hat when I show up. So sometimes as boards you make decisions, as pools you make decisions that may have a negative impact on your organization, meaning it may cost you more in premium dollars or more in potential self-funded claim issues. But at the end of the day, you have to look at what the goal is of the pool, and that's long-term sustainability. And you got to make financial decisions that are based on what will happen 10, 15, 20 years down the road, and not what's going to happen in your current budget cycle. That's important, but I always have to wear a different hat. My wife says, I only have one drawer open at a time, and she goes, what drawer do you have open today? So try to stay in your lane, so to speak. I think that's important. When you get ready for agendas, make sure you understand your meeting. Make sure if you have questions, ask those questions of staff ahead of time. Don't sit and lay in wait to ambush the staff at a meeting because you don't like a decision that the board's taken. So I think that does a disservice and really creates a lot of dissent and is very disruptive to the team in that process. So remember, you got a professional staff of administration, same thing you want your governing body to do. If you have that role in your professional life, I think that's extremely important. So you can't learn it all, and you won't know it all. I think it's just important to make sure that you trust your staff.
That's great. You know, one of the lessons we've learned from new board members in our pool is that it's helpful for them to know how much time it may take for them really to start catching on. You know, there's new terminology, there's understanding the business, there's understanding board dynamics and culture, and you know, it's been helpful for them when they give us feedback about, boy, it takes about 3 years. Now, I'm sure it may take less or more depending on the organization, but for us, it takes about 3 years to feel comfortable in your position. And I know too, as a pool administrator, that and having been around for a little bit, that you know, you pick up a little bit of something on everything, and it's easy to think that you know you can be a subject matter on everything, and you really can't. And it's good to recognize when you need outside help to come in and talk to the board about whether it be actuarial studies, something that would be helpful for them to hear from somebody who just has more expertise in that area. So staff has to be willing to say, you know what, you know, I know something about this, but it'd be better if somebody else, you know, came in. John, I think we're at the point where we want to talk about some operational items.
Yeah, I think that'd be good. But first, we have a poll.
Yes.
Thanks, John. I'm just distributing that poll, and we'll give that just about 30 to 45 seconds for people to participate. And then I will hand things back over to you to start talking about those operational issues. And I think once you get, when you come to a breaking point, John, you can let me know when you want me to deliver those results to you, and I'll hop back in.
Okay.
So just 1 second, and I will close that poll. I'll give people another 10 seconds. So please do vote.
Well, as people are finishing up their voting, I think the next section that we want to talk about is moving from the orientation part of those types of conversations to conversations about operations, because really self-insurance business is a different animal than most people are used to. You know, as fellow CEOs, there's not a whole lot of us in the world that do what we do, and for board members, it's the same thing. It's a different type of animal to be dealing with, and I think from an operational standpoint, the conversations that need to be held, we certainly need to look at what is this business of pooling and ensure that the board and each individual board member has that understanding. You know, it's public, it's not the private sector. There's lots of new words and language, lots of new concepts. You know, I will admit that before I got into this business 25 years ago, I didn't use the word actuary or actuarial study very often, and there's probably a lot of people out there who have the same experience. Getting the board to understand, to the degree it's necessary, who are the regulatory authorities and what type of organization are you. In California, for example, we're highly unregulated, but in other states there's a great deal of regulation. You're treated much like an insurance company. So what's the environment in which you are operating, and make sure that you know, board members understand what is their legal status and what are the regulations governing their operation. And then, you know, looking at the financial reports, how do they reflect what the organization is doing as an self-insurance entity? You know, our long-term, our perspective is a bit longer term than our member cities who are working with their general fund from one year to the next. We're looking at a longer term perspective of claims that are coming in and being paid out over perhaps decades versus when's the next election and what are we needing to think about for working on streets or working on parks or those sorts of things, which are a much shorter perspective. Of course, there are new things that all the board members are going to be experiencing with the foundational documents, whether it's called a memorandum of coverage or an insurance policy. What are those documents? How does the pooling agreement work? What are the cost allocation formulas? How are members treated equitably, or what are the differences among members? So really getting to know the operational, functional part of it. It's not necessary that, again, back into the discussion of the weeds, we don't necessarily want a board member to be really deep into it, but they're going to be making decisions that will reflect on the organization. So having these foundational concepts down is really important. We talk about what is the culture of an organization, and I think to some degree that's largely reflected in the mission, vision, and values of the organization. How's it gone through a strategic planning process, or has it developed a mission for what it's trying to do and a vision for what it's trying to do, and how do those relate to the services being offered or the coverage being offered? In California, it's governed by contract law. What is covered under the memorandum of coverage? So we cover things in our pool you can't even buy insurance for. And there's things that you can buy insurance for that we don't cover. So it's really the agreement among the members on the culture and the decision of what's in the benefit of the members. We also talk about things the board should know about the organizational structure. Who does what? Who are our partners? Who on staff is responsible for interacting with those partners and those who are interacting with the members, and how are those things evaluated? I think Jim's probably got some thoughts on how he deals with the organizational structure that he's dealing with, as well as the board. So maybe Jim, you could add some insights.
Thank you, John. It's interesting, if you've been around pooling for a while, as probably many of us have, is that there's no one particular way that's the perfect model, and there are different pool management models. For example, bringing claims, risk control in-house versus contracting it out. Within our road commission world, we have a property casualty pool that has brought everything in-house, where we tend to contract everything out. So there is no one right way or wrong way. I think you have to look at the pros and cons, but depending on what the model that you have, it's important for the board to understand who are the players and actually the organization, and who does what. And one of the key ways of doing this we found to be helpful was to have an organizational chart in a trustee's handbook. We also set up particular times where the trustees hear reports from our service providers. It's interesting, even from those that contract services out, it can be a little bit confusing for the board, because they think that once you contract it out, it's that company's responsibility. And at least with our organization, the way we've set it up is that whether they're employees or the contracted services, the pool administrator is still responsible for the quality of the service providers. And so I meet regularly with our service providers as if they were staff. We have full-time people within the service providers who are dedicated to our business. So even though on the organizational chart it may look like you have few employees, if you have a lot of service providers, you actually do have a bigger staff than what it might appear. But understanding the organizational structure and who reports to who is, I think, critical in understanding, gee, how do things get done? Who's on staff and who's not?
And if I could jump in and just say from a board's perspective, a board member's perspective, I think it's really, really important that everybody encourage each other to ask questions, educate yourself, take advantage of the AGRiP opportunities, and networking with each other. But ask questions before the meetings, during the meetings, after the meetings, to your administrator, to your fellow board members. Nobody's expecting you to know everything, especially on a board. And I think the best thing you can do is just ask questions.
One thing,
Yeah, that's a great point.
if I could just jump in real quick. This, Craig, if you would always remember why you were formed, always, why, OMAC was formed when there wasn't any insurance. It was out of necessity to have some basic coverage. So, that's back to the foundation and why were you created. Have an understanding where you came from so don't forget your roots, so to speak. It's kind of like pools will change and get better over time, but always remember why you got started, why you were created. Remember the membership, the value of those shareholders that own the company. If you're not driving that shareholder value, if you're not doing things that create better coverages and do things that are a benefit to the membership, you need to maybe recheck and think about what it is you're doing and where you are and what your role really is on that governing body.
Yeah, Craig, I think that's a great addition to really giving the board's perspective on, what is the organization doing, and always going back to recheck, why is it important for the board to understand the memorandum of coverage and the coverage that's being offered or the programs that are being provided to the members. So thank you for that input. Stephanie, do you have results from our last poll?
I do. Our question was, does my pool conduct board orientation? And 86% of our attendees do have a board orientation, 10% do not, and 5% of attendees were not quite sure. So a healthy, robust number participate in orientation, and a handful not so much.
All right. I'm guessing that 5% probably would be a no, but so one of the things I think that's really important for us to touch on, and that's really the board's relationship with one another, but also looking at the board trying to determine how is it doing. At our pool, we don't really do that, but in some pools, they do. And I think, Mary, you and Jim experience that to some degree. Maybe you want to comment on that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. We do. We annually, when we evaluate our administrator, we also evaluate our board. We do it collectively as a group, and we also evaluate ourselves individually. And we've turned over the last few years to more of a conversation with each other about it than scoring ourselves or making sure that we are, circling the right number on the form. And it's really been quite interesting because it gives us an opportunity to check in with where we started with our strategic planning workshop and what our plan was for the year and what our goals were, because we set goals for ourselves as well as the administrator. And it just gives us a real opportunity to touch base, check in, see how we're doing individually and as a board. And it gives us an opportunity to, if there's an issue, that we can call it out, or if there's just on the flip side of that, we can also commend ourselves if we think we're doing something pretty good. It's kind of nice. And as far as I'll wait. I'm sorry. I jumped ahead. I was just going to go on. I was going to jump on to the staff being accountable and the importance of that, and how it really provides the same opportunity as a board discussing the administrator, being accountable, and the staff, making sure that everybody's pulling the rope in the right direction, and that those items that were identified as a part of what was important, where are we headed, what are we doing, are we actually getting there? And sometimes it's hard to quantify, but other times it's easier than it looks. It's you can figure out, was this goal met? If you don't set a goal, you really don't know that. So I think that those evaluation processes are very important everybody hates them. They're tedious. Sometimes it's challenging, but I think that at the end of the day, it's time well spent, and it's better for the health of the board and the pool in the long run.
That's great. I'm glad you brought those things up. I think that the only thing that I would add to holding staff accountable or really measuring is, how do you go about that? Are there specific goals that as a board you want to set for staff, or is it measurement through member satisfaction surveys? There's a lot of ways to go about it, but you really do need to make sure there's some way to measure how staff is performing and how the organization is performing, whether it be at the board level with a self-evaluation, the board's evaluation of staff self-evaluation, or the members providing their feedback. It's really important. Jim, I think we're going to head to you for strategic thinking.
You're looking to me now, huh? Thanks, John. I had a thought listening to Mary related to this that kind of leads into this section on strategic planning. Stephanie, did you want to do the poll or a poll?
Yep, I will launch that poll right now, Jim, and we can come back to it. And while we wait for that poll to launch, we did get a question that came in while we were finishing up that last section, and it came in the context of the board evaluation discussion, but it might also have a little bit to do with something the group talked about earlier on, which is duty to pool versus member. And the attendee was asking, what strategies or tactics have been used by the speakers to help what they described as a rogue board member get back on the duty to the pool versus duty to member train? So the idea is that person who's dissenting in public after the vote and behaving as an individual with duty to member versus as a member of the whole following that vote and supporting the majority. So how do you help that rogue board member come back into the fold and see their duty to the pool?
I think I'll jump in if it's okay, and just give you an idea of what we do at CRASIF. And it's a relatively new within the last 10-year experience, but also one that's been very effective and very helpful. We've had that happen, of course. And one of the things that we do in setting those expectations for ourselves is identify, what do we do, exactly this, what do we do when this happens? And one of the things that we came up with is, it's really important for us all to keep it in the car. If there's a problem, if there's dissension amongst our board, it's really important that we talk about it and work through it at the board level, not include our membership. And when that happens, as it often, or not often, but as it will occasionally, it's important for the board members, the board chair, sometimes, if it's the most appropriate, to talk to that person and say, wait a minute, you've made a commitment here to this board, and we all are expecting you to respect that. And so it's important that you identify that as one of the expectations of your board going in, because then that lets everybody know what they might expect when something like that occurs.
I agree with Mary on that. We've been fortunate that haven't had to deal with that issue much, because we air conversation at board level meetings and we get most of that aired out. But it's important to make sure they understand that why they're there, and that you don't do anything but create ill will and you run the membership, and it's not important. And you're wanting to champion a cause that has been vetted and it was found not worthy, and so you need to find and refocus on something else that's more important. But I've been fortunate we haven't had to deal with that. But I think those are just frank conversations that the board member needs to have, the chair have with that individual, or a couple of board members have with that individual, to try to get them back on track and get them back in the fold.
Jim, would you like me to share the results of our last poll?
That'd be helpful, Stephanie. Go ahead.
Great. So our last question was, my public entity pool regularly engages in the following: And we ask people to select all that apply. And if you look at the slide in front of you, we ask people to weigh in on the items on that slide. So 100% of our attendees report that their pool does participate in strategic planning, 79% budget with a long-term perspective, 36% engage in succession planning, 57% in assessments of member satisfaction and needs, and 79% in professional development for governing body and staff. And we are at about 10 minutes to the hour, so we've got about 10 minutes to work through this last section of our conversation on strategic issues.
Right, Stephanie, thank you. The comment I want to make listening to the conversation, and it's kind of a step back here, is that for our listeners, and as for me as I think about this, it's good to evaluate based on the conversation we're having, what level of conversation we have as a board. And the initial discussion or question about the rogue board member, we initially started out with a standard form. And over time, it developed into what Mary indicated, more of a conversation. But if it's new to you, that conversation is difficult to have, starting off with some kind of evaluation sheet can be a good beginning step. And part of where we're going with the strategic side and looking forward is the key to strategic planning. And using basketball terminology, I think of it as a game plan. And it's key that everybody be on the same page. I mean, we know those kinds of things. But from an administrative side, what I found that I've struggled with in the years, recently come to understand, is that, as a pool administrator, sometimes I would think that as a strategic plan, I'd have to come up with new initiatives every year. And I think that can put undue pressure on you, and it can create undue pressure on you if the board perceives that way. Sometimes a good strategic plan is just reaffirming what you are doing well. And if it lines up with your vision and your mission statement, your values, then you can just continue to renew the focus on that particular strategic plan. The budgeting part, well, let me back up a little bit. Craig, did you want to say anything about the strategic plan?
Well, just from a board's perspective, once that strategic plan has been adopted, I mean, you are making decisions throughout the rest of the year on items that address that strategic plan. Are you moving forward? And I think it's the board's responsibility at this point to hold the staff accountable, make sure that they're moving down the strategic plan. Maybe there's a change that needs to be occurred. We need to make that change. Well, let's make a conscious decision to make that change so we know that we are actually going to make a change. I agree. A lot of times you're doing the business that you need to do. It's continuing about, I always bring this back to, there's owners of this company and they're the membership. And I think if you focus on how do you make sure you drive shareholder value, and that's by providing the best quality service that you can provide, I think that's real important. So I think just keep those things kind of in mindset as you work through that. But as a board, you got to make sure that staff is moving forward and they're adhering to the strategic plan and they're not diverting somewhere.
That's a great point. I think it's good to look at your budget from a board perspective as well as staff, and to look at, are your resources and the amount of your resources lining up with who you are and your vision. For example, in our organization, we spend, I think, $5,000 per member on risk control. We value risk control, and that's where we spend a good amount of our resources. But in terms of the budget with a long-term perspective, I think the key here is knowing where you want to be in 3 to 5 years. And part of bringing the team perspective in is that you want to make sure that at board level as well as staff, there's no hidden agendas. You really need to be on the same page. Greg, is there anything to that?
Yeah, I would agree. And we'll talk about back earlier about the roles that you wear, various hats that you have to wear. And I think that's important you wear a hat for today, but you're entrusted with wearing a hat for 15 years down the road. And you always have to be mindful of that. I just think that's the most key component don't make a short-term decision for some temporary relief that's going to cause you long-term pain, in 10 years down the road. If you don't maintain financial viability of your pool, you've done a tremendous disservice to the membership. I know that's not always easy, and I know this comes with challenging decisions that have to be made, but I think the big goal has got to be maintain that financial viability of the pool, and that necessitates taking that extremely long-term look and view, managing your losses and establishing your budget and how you move forward and where you want to go at the end of the day.
Excellent comments. And for the time that we have left, I'm going to move things along just a little bit quicker here. Succession plan for staff and board. Found it very helpful to have really two kinds. One of it is emergency succession, and the other one is succession planning in terms of long-term turnover, retiring staff. Both of those are extremely important. It's good, again, to have this conversation with staff and the board because things change in people's lives and perspectives can change. And so if the board has a good idea of what the executive is thinking, and if the executive knows kind of where the board is at in terms of what the composition is going to look like, it's helpful for long-term planning and for working well together. Anybody want to just add anything to that real quick? Okay. Members' needs are being met. How to measure that? In our discussion, we thought about how you know the needs, the services you're providing are really meeting your members' needs. And it's easy to kind of do things because it sounds good, but my experience, I found that you just got to, one, keep in touch with your membership, and then also that you want to have some kind of feedback loop. And we do member surveys about one every 2 years that evaluate the program and give people an opportunity to put something in writing. We try to make it easy and fast, just like any evaluation should be. But the more you develop a feedback loop, as I call it, in everything, the better you can be. And something we just tried new this year is we have a QR code that we show our members who are attendees in a training session. And once the training session is done, they actually, with their cameras, can use the QRC code, or if they don't have a camera, they can get a website address. And right there, there's a quick 10 questions evaluating the program. It's still a process that we're refining, but again, it gives us that feedback. Professional development. John, do you want to say something about this?
Sure, I just want to jump in and share that this is a conversation that the board needs to have to talk about how it can get better as they're getting training. Board members can go to AGRiP, they can go to other organizations and associations and really become aware of the current best practices. And it's important that the board recognize the value of staff attending those events as well, because we can all sit in our own little communities and with our own little group of members and have a very insular perspective, but seeing what's happening on the other side of the Rockies or the other side of the Mississippi or the other side of the world helps the pool perform better by knowing that there are other ways to do things. And so it's important that the board have that conversation and consider that money needs to be budgeted to send both board members and staff members to these educational opportunities.
Absolutely. And sometimes you can actually make it a requirement as a board that you will attend one professional development, AGRiP, if you will, conference a year is just part of your own professional development. Now, whether or not you can require it, that's another thing. But to show the importance of it to the board, you can have a conversation that just says, hey, this is our expectation. You choose the one that you think makes the most sense. And let's continue to have those conversations because it is a great platform for continuing that conversation?
Well,
I
yep.
think
We have come up against it. So I want to say thank you to John and Jim, Mary and Craig, our speakers, for sharing their insights and thoughts around some of the strategic and operational and other issues that are important for boards to consider. And I really want to thank our attendees for taking time out of their day to participate and explore what these issues mean to your pool, as well as for raising some questions. I mentioned earlier that we'll post a copy of this webinar to the AGRiP website. You can look for that in the next week or so. And I do hope to see some of you in a few weeks at the CEO and Senior Staff Institute in early August. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of you and have a lovely remainder of your day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks.